Good day and welcome to another installment of the Gritty Tales Writing Vlog. I am your host and sole proprietor, Tyler M Mathis, and today we are going to be discussing the basics of backstory. Now, most stories have backstory, and all backstory is what came before. The past events that caused or influenced the dire and dramatic events now transpiring in your book. Our characters don't just spring from nothing. They have histories. Whether they're your main character whom we've known from the beginning or a minor yet key character brought in much later, past events have brought these characters to this point in your story. And at some point, we need to learn these characters' histories in order for their existence and present actions to make sense. Backstory also applies to events. Take a battle, for instance. Why is it being fought? It's being fought over territory, factional hatred, the hand of some fair maiden? Is it just one more battle in a long war? Or is this the decisive battle, the last day? Without backstory, we have no idea what's going on. About the only exception to including a backstory is in flash fiction due to length limitations. And I suppose it works there because of the wonder factor of not having a backstory, of leaving the reader to ponder why the character or event happened. But longer flash fiction will oftentimes include some backstory context, and later on we'll discuss purposely leaving out portions of backstory just to keep readers guessing. Getting the details of your backstory straight is obviously important. The more pressing factor, however, is how you present your backstories. That is, when and how much you reveal. This is a crucial factor in how you pace your story within the narrative of present events. Many authors, even big names, come to grief on backstory because it is not easy information to smoothly introduce without hampering the pace of your story. So today we'll cover some of the basics of how to properly present your backstories to make them both entertaining and timely to ensure proper pacing. If you are writing a novel, then you've likely spent a great deal of time thinking about the backstory of your main character and other important characters. And if you're working on something even bigger, say a fantasy or a sci-fi series, then you might have designed an entire world or a star system. And by all means, the more information you have, the better, because all those little details are good for you to know, because they take the guesswork out of your writing and you have to create fewer details on the fly. Details you may have to go back and fix later because it turns out what you ad-libbed doesn't fit with the rest of your story. Your readers, however, don't need to know all the details of your backstory. In fact, sometimes you'll want to keep them guessing, perhaps forever. In the A Song of Ice and Fire series, better known as Game of Thrones for you Philistines who only know that awful, ridiculous TV show, there are dozens of unanswered questions regarding the sketchy portions of Martin's backstory. So many that there are entire forums devoted to the topic. But what Martin does reveal is crucial to the story, and by my estimation, about 15 to 20% of the Song of Ice and Fire series is backstory. In many cases, going back to the beginning of time. And Martin pulls it off masterfully. He splices it in when necessary and in proper context to the present plot and the POV character's chapter. So you've got your character and event histories fleshed out well. First, you need to figure out how much to reveal, and then how and when you're going to reveal it. And here is where first-time authors, myself included at one time, fly completely off the rails. Nobody cares! Remember that. When readers begin your story, they do not care about your characters. You have to make them care. And until you've done that, you should keep your backstory to a minimum. We need to see what conflicts this character is facing right now before we get into what brought them here. Now, you could give their detailed backstory up front, but there are problems with that. Major problems. Don't do it. Let me explain. First off, the biggie, as I'm sure most of you have heard, is that you're showing and not telling. Now, the whole show and tell thing is something that we'll get into in a future vlog. But yeah, by doing that, you're showing and not telling. Say our main character is Susie. She's a poor mother who's been out of work for a very long time. Now, we can come right out and say that, but wouldn't that bit of backstory be better revealed in details during the course of the narrative? For example, to communicate that Susie is poor, we can describe her shitty apartment. We're going to have to do it anyway, and it's a hellhole where only a poor person would live. As for making her a mother, there are children's toys lying about. Or maybe she walks into the kitchen and it's a mess because the kids haven't cleaned up after themselves. She wakes up late. Maybe she sees a collection notice in her mail indicating she doesn't hold a job and times are really hard. For those of you who don't understand the show versus tell concept, that's a perfect example of how to show backstory. And as I said, we'll delve into this in detail in a future vlog. Now, as for the rest of Susie's backstory, where she worked, how many kids she has, and what their names are, whether she's dating someone, those details aren't really important in the early going. We're relating she's a poor, unemployed mother. Done. We did that. Now let's get her into some conflict before we reveal more about her. Let's persuade the reader to care about Susie. Once we've done that, then readers will want to know more about her. But in the case I just described, what does the new author do 9 times out of 10? He barfs out Susie's history like a frat kid who just downed a bottle of Jack. Paragraph after paragraph, right up front from page 1. Her exact age, family background, how many kids she has and details on them, her employment history, whom she's currently dating and information about him. Just on and on and on about a character the reader doesn't give a damn about yet. How can a reader root for a character and be interested in them if they've been in no conflict yet? So 2 rules are at work here. 1, reveal a minimum of backstory early while concentrating on the main story and building conflict. And 2, don't puke it all out at once, even if you do the right thing and decide to wait a bit to relate more backstory, as we'll now discuss. Susie will now demonstrate pacing for us. While setting the stage, we've included a modicum of backstory in our narrative. Now we lay on the conflict. The phone rings. It's the high school. Her son Stephen has not reported for classes. Here her heart sinks, and we get a little more backstory. Stephen is a troubled teen for whatever reasons. Maybe he's autistic or a geek, or he's just a bad seed. Say we use option 3, he's a bad seed. That's a great excuse to mention his absentee father and maybe that Stephen resembles him. Mom thinks, oh, if only he could be like Jody, my darling little boy and the baby of the family, such a bright boy and an excellent student. Are you beginning to understand what I mean? We're filling in little details of Susie's backstory as we relate what's going on in the present, thus keeping the story flowing and the reader interested. By the time Susie gets off the phone, we know a ton of things about her and we've advanced the plot as well. We're on page 3 or so right now. We might still be on page 2, and look at all we've accomplished. Now, Consider the fool's option of dumping all that backstory and info on the reader from the get-go. Let's say the book opens with Susie lying in bed, dreading the beginning of another day. She thinks and laments on her past, and all the backstory is covered before the story even gets started. Once we've vomited all that up, we're on page 6, and Susie hasn't even gotten out of bed yet. Nothing has happened. All the author has done is deliver a boring essay on the life of a poor mother. But what does the inexperienced author say? It's all over now! Now I can tell my story start to finish with no interruptions for pesky backstory. Right. Well, that works great in theory. But in reality, you have no readers. Why? Because the first few pages of any book on Amazon or the other booksellers are available to read for free as short samples. In option 1, Susie is well into conflict by the end of that sample section. In option 2, she hasn't even gotten out of bed, and the potential reader got tired of her sob story on page 2 and clicked onward to purchase another book that was more interesting. The same goes with backstory of events. Let's use our battle scene sample from earlier. We'll make it a fantasy battle. Some heavy cavalry getting ready to charge and an enemy forming up across the field. It's early in the story and our readers aren't really sure what's going on. Our main character is a cavalryman named Magnus, and as he sits upon his destrier awaiting the order to charge, he rudely jokes with his barbarous buddies, and we relate a few things through conversation and use short instances of backstory narrative to elaborate. We learn who Magnus fights for and who the enemy is. We learn his rank. We learn some of his comrades' names, that it's been a long war, but his army is winning and this could be the last battle. Maybe we mention the king's name or the skilled enemy commander across the field who has dragged out the war. Maybe a plot point is Magnus has a personal vendetta against the enemy commander. Now, we can allude to that vendetta early on, but don't spill the details on that just yet. Conflict has been introduced, that's what matters. So leave the details vague for now. So we have the basic info, good guys, bad guys, and the reason they're on that field. And we built it all while setting the scene. Basic scene setting for atmosphere and minimal backstory is all that's needed here. So let the charge begin. Now, here's some backstory regarding Magnus that should be revealed at some point, but that we don't want to put up front with our opening cavalry charge scene. Reason or backstory points such as why the war started in the first place, exactly how long it's gone on, how many kids Magnus has, how long the king has been in power, etc., etc. None of that is important right now before this battle scene. Now, if you can slip some of it in passing, that's fine, but don't try to shoehorn too many details in, because that's only going to bog down your pace. I know that this sounds simple, but new authors will barf out that backstory in detail first chance they get almost every time. And I know this because I'm guilty of it. I did exactly the same thing in my first novel, Nobility, because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I saw no problem with it. I had created a character I loved and figured everyone else would love him too, so I explained him up front and put all that behind us just so I could get to the good stuff and not be interrupted. Because I didn't know that nobody cares about your backstory. Remember that. Nobody cares about your backstory until they care about your characters and your stories. I can't say it enough. Keep it moving, keep it interesting, and once your character is established as a protagonist worth rooting for, then you can introduce those longer, detailed passages of backstory at appropriate points. And by then, your readers won't just tolerate your backstory, they will enjoy it because they want to know more about Susie or Magnus or whoever the hell you're writing about. Now, in regard to minor characters and minor events, the scale of backstory is taken down many notches. Most characters don't deserve a detailed backstory. In minor character backstories, you reveal only pertinent information to the story, which will explain why these characters are in the story to begin with. As in describing minor characters, their physical attributes and whatnot, same with backstory, a couple of main points will do. And as discussed earlier, try to show and not tell the minor character's backstory. And it's pretty much the same with minor events. Just relate what's necessary to the story and cut it off. No more is needed. Now for the moment you've all been waiting for. We're going to cover the grammar of backstory. I know most of you shudder at the word grammar, but I assure you this is a simple lesson. Just keep in mind that I am not an English teacher, nor do I hold a degree in English. Therefore, I strongly suggest that you look up the past perfect verb tense on your favorite grammar app or in whatever grammar book or style manual you use for the proper definition and more information and examples. And if you don't have a handy source to help you with grammar issues, find one today. I guarantee you even the greats have grammar manuals close to hand whenever they sit down to write. So let's start with the past perfect verb tense. When I started writing, I had, grammatically speaking, a leg up. I had grown up in a household where proper English was spoken most of the time. I had graduated high school and gone through a couple of years of college where I fulfilled all of my English requirements. Nevertheless, remembering and applying the teachings of grammar courses years later was no easy thing, and I struggled to learn what I began calling the past tense, that's hyphenated, which I used when writing backstory, because I knew it wasn't supposed to be written in the regular past tense. Of course, this past is properly known as the past perfect verb tense, as I relearned when consulting a grammar manual that I hadn't picked up in 10 years. Using the term past to describe the past perfect tense isn't far off, for that's what it's used for, to describe past events when writing in the past tense. Now, most stories are written in the past tense. The story has already happened and a narrator, either first person or third, is telling it to you. And yes, there's a second person narrator tense as well, but that's rarely used and for good reason. But I digress. So let us return to Susie. We've moved her story along and we're in the thick of things now. Her ex comes over to pick up the kids and we need a brief backstory on their failed marriage. So how do we do it properly in the past perfect tense? We don't say that they were married for 5 years. That implies they are still married, for the sentence is still in past tense. We're going back further, beyond past tense, so we write it past perfect. They had been married for 5 years. When it's written in past perfect, we know the marriage is over. Same with Magnus. His army had been fighting the bad guys for several years, not they were fighting for several years. Now here's the twist. When it comes to longer passages of backstory, you can revert to the past tense again, for the reader knows you've launched into a longer passage of backstory. And all those hads are not only tedious to write, but no longer necessary. I'll use an example from my short story, The Storytellers, which appears in Gritty Tales. An omnivorous reader since childhood, Myron had decided by his junior year of high school that he wanted to write for a living. He signed up for a creative writing course, and the teacher soon recognized him as a gifted storyteller with a brilliant imagination, even as she criticized his weak character development, atrocious syntax, and monotonous style. None of his stories earned better than a B-. Myron blamed his failures as a writer on the general pressures of high school life. Passage over. Notice we dropped the past perfect had after the first sentence. Not needed, because we've established it's past back in Myron's high school days. To keep putting had before every verb and turning it past perfect just clutters things and belabors the point. We know Myron's high school days are further in the past, so once said is enough. Now, in longer backstories, I mean, we're talking, many paragraphs, whatever the case, I'll throw in a couple more past perfect sentences now and then. Usually I'll do this if the subject matter changes abruptly, but the events are still way in the past. And this is done just to remind the reader that we haven't warped out of backstory during that radical shift or that abrupt shift in the subject matter. That's the only reason you need to do that. Now, if those of you who fancy writing in present tense are confused about writing backstory, just relax, because you have it even easier. All you need do to indicate backstory is shift from present into past tense. No perfect verb tense necessary. As I said, even easier. The only problem with switching to past for backstory from the present tense is I always think an editor will mistakenly think in some cases that I've just dropped out of present tense by habit. And it's possible your readers might think that unless you indicate in other ways that you've gone into the past just for backstory. It's not a mistake. So just kind of watch for that. As I said, it's something you shouldn't have to worry about, but you kind of do. So just be careful on making those transitions from present tense into the present tense backstory written in the past. But the most important point for backstory in present tense is you do not revert into present tense once you start the backstory, as you revert to past from past perfect in the past tense sample above. I know it's confusing as hell, so let me just try to say this again. So in past, we go to backstory, we go to past perfect, then we switch back to past because the perfect's no longer necessary. In present, we revert to past, but we stay there for the entire backstory. That's just how it's done. I'm not going to elaborate any more on it. As I said, grammar manuals. I hope that straightens out any backstory grammar issues you might have. It's very hard to relate these sort of things on a vlog with no whiteboard to scribble on, or with my inability basically to make videos, because I'm not a videographer. I'm just a guy, a writer who sits behind a camera and talks about writing. So as I suggested, refer to grammar sources for more information on this. Or better yet, examine how your favorite authors handle every aspect of backstory. Then you go and do likewise. Classrooms are wonderful for teaching things like grammar, but you learn the tricks of fiction writing only by reading, and one of those tricks that you're really only going to learn by reading is backstory. And that's going to wrap it up for backstory, folks. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe, and be sure to check out the links to my books below, as well as the Gritty Tales writing group on Facebook and my Amazon author page. Thank you for watching. That is all.